we've seen breaches as they've continued to increase year over year. The records of the breaches, we thought this year might be one of these years where we don't see as many records lost, certainly in comparison to last year when we saw the records of some of the large multi-billion record breaches. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen some massive breaches that brought us somewhat back up to par from 2017 here now in 2018. Certainly cloud security exploded. And I think the key here is in 2018, we think about cloud security. Now, clouds had security for a while, and the cloud vendors themselves have been working toward enabling and providing solutions for organizations going to the cloud. But this year we've seen a mass migration, if you will, for security vendors themselves saying, I have to have a solution in the cloud. What am I doing for the cloud? Some of them have cloud native solutions, some of them don't. But the fact is we've seen cloud security exploding onto the scene saying this is how we can help solve certain problems in the cloud depending on what type of technology it happens to be. And certainly we've seen insider threats in 2018, as they've always been, continue to have issues. We've seen security solutions that are out there to try and solve some of those problems for the insider threats. But it hasn't gone away. It's still there. It's why we still see data being lost or data being shared or data being exposed in the news every single day. So let's go to the first prediction that we have of 2019, increased regulation compliance around data security. This is not necessarily a surprising one, and it's one that's continued year over year, to be honest. But we see this continuing in 2019. We don't see any let-up of regulation and compliance with regard to data in 2019. As a matter of fact, frankly, we see it accelerating. We know, of course, in 2018, GDPR began. We know that there are other countries, whether it be Turkey, Thailand, Australia, Japan, even California, another country, a state, California, New York DFS. We continue to see more and more and more regulation. And while I think most security professionals would say, I don't build my security strategy around regulation, the reality is regulation does begin to create a baseline for what the foundation of what a security program at least needs to achieve to avoid whatever penalties, compliance fines, or brand damage that might be out there. I think at the same time, this type of regulation is indicative of the importance that, whether it be an industry, a country, or even the public, puts on private data, saying, look, apparently the organizations that are losing data either don't have the appropriate focus, the appropriate technology, the appropriate budget, whatever it may be, around the data that they perceive or the consumer perceives as important. And I think the other factor that we'll get to later on is, what about the data you don't perceive as important? It might not be important to you, but it might be important to someone else, and we'll get to that. The point here is, when we think about regulation, yes, the cost of a regulation is expensive. When we think about a data breach, up to $7 million. I suspect a lot of you on the call today, maybe you've received a letter. If you travel very often like I do, you may have received a letter saying you might have had your records exposed, you might want to change your email, you might want to get credit monitoring, et cetera. That's not necessarily an unusual circumstance, right? And we're seeing more and more companies, I think, today come out and say, look, I don't know if I was breached. I know that I had an exposure. I found a vulnerability, or someone found a vulnerability, but we don't have any evidence that data was even breached. Yet even over the last month or so, we've seen organizations come out proactively, and I think this is a good thing, come out proactively and say, we're not sure if we were breached or not. We're doing the investigation, but we know we were exposed. We want to proactively let the public know about this. I think this is a little bit of a shift from the norm that we've seen over the past years, where either companies were just completely unaware that they had a breach and didn't find out about the breach for months or years later. Or when they were identified as having a breach, in some cases, they didn't even notify the public about the breach. Here we're seeing a massive shift to proactive notification. I think we'll continue to see this kind of shift as you see more regulations putting in their statements. You need to make the public aware when data is exposed or breached, and we're seeing more and more about this. Let's move on to the next one here. So we think about cloud. Cloud is something that we see all the time. We hear about it all the time, and of course, cloud's been growing. And we think about cloud, it could be public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, whatever. But the reality is when we think about security in the cloud, it's been slower to grow than the use of the cloud. People have had network firewalls and other sorts of baseline technologies in the cloud for years. But we're seeing and we recognize in 2019 that there will be an increased pace of reliance on cloud services. And those cloud services not only will be the infrastructure and platform and technologies that you're using on the cloud to deliver your own services, but also the services that will exist to help secure and enable that transition to the cloud, so that as you move to the cloud and as you have technologies on-premise or in your own private cloud or wherever else, you can link all those pieces together. And that's what we're seeing as a massive rush into 2019. We look at some of the statistics here, of course. Today in 2018, here going into 2019, here we can see on-premise is about 37% of overall workloads being run there. See that decreasing by about 10%. These are just statistics, but the fact is nothing's going down except for the on-premise. And it's moving to the cloud, and workloads are moving to the cloud. I think an important note here is when we think about the predictions that we see for 2019 and 2020, even going forward, in the short term, in the 2019, our expectation is that, yes, organizations will continue to move applications, continue to move file storage and file usage into the cloud. And to some degree, they'll continue to move even their database, their data repositories, whether they're big data, NoSQL, relational databases, what have you, or managed databases, even within Amazon or Microsoft or Google or whatever. As we see more and more companies move these workloads into the cloud, they're obviously going to be looking for security solutions that are out there as well. And so what our prediction is here is that you as a consumer and as a user should expect to see in 2019, if you're on the floor of a conference or security conference, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find a security vendor not talking about their capacity to support you in the cloud. I think as an organization, you're going to be looking for those kinds of organizations that can say, look, I don't only support the cloud, but I also support your on-premise. I fully expect in 2019 organizations to begin looking for technologies that can bridge that gap, cross that chasm, if you will, between where you are today and where you're going tomorrow, but at the same time be able to support both at the same time. Security organizations, as you know, are already small, so trying to split that organization in two, and one of the predictions we'll have coming up as well, trying to educate your team on parts of the team that would be cloud experts, but also security experts. It's hard to broaden that landscape of skills across multiple teams. It's easier to have one team that retains their skills. It's a firewall, folks. It's a data security solution. It's a web application technology. Whatever it happens to be, know what it is, but simply have a technology that supports multiple platforms. That's what we're recognizing here in 2019 is technologies that will be able to cross that chasm, cross that gap for organizations as organizations continue their path and continue their growth into the years ahead. The other key point here, I think, for this, when we think about reliance on cloud and traditional IT services, is also by industry. And while these numbers look large for public cloud consumption in 2020, the other thing that we see in 2019 is while even your most regulated, talking about the prior prediction here, even the most regulated industries are moving to the cloud. Financial services are moving to the cloud. Healthcare is moving to the cloud. Even to some degree, government moves to the cloud. But those organizations, in our prediction here in 2019, will still retain most, if not all, of their core, most critical assets on-prem, where they truly have or have the perceived control of all that environment, where they have the traditional controls they have in place. And in many cases, even their legacy systems, obviously, that may not transition to the cloud, will still remain on-premise. However, those workloads that are newer workloads, your web portal, your mobile interfaces, your Internet of Things devices, those sorts of things, those are likely to move to the cloud with interfaces and connections back into the on-prem where the data will reside. I do believe it'll be a few years before most of those core systems begin to transition to the cloud as well, as companies begin this, in 2019, this exodus, if you will, to the cloud, but being able to provide security enablement on top of it. So we talked about, that skills gap a little bit. We talked about, trying to have an organization where you have people that are cloud experts, network experts, security experts, et cetera. So we recognize as well in 2019, we're going to continue to see the growth of AI and machine learning to meet a skills gap. I think what we saw in previous years in terms of predictions, and obviously AI is not new, but in previous years what we've seen in terms of predictions, we've seen people say, look, I want to use AI, machine learning to decrease the number of alerts that I have, make my job easier, make my technology more effectual, right? Make it so that my technology actually tells me what's important to me versus me having to figure it out and read 1,000 alerts a day. That's been the traditional use of AI in many cases within security because it was the low-hanging fruit of security. And the fact is, that's not necessarily going to change over the course of the year, over the course of the next couple of years. If we look at some of the numbers here, right? So 1.8 million cybersecurity professionals in terms of a gap for 2022, right? People just aren't available and don't have the skills necessary. When we think about the fact that when we think about people who apply for these roles, statistically, 75% of them are likely to be unqualified or insufficiently qualified for the job they're actually applying for when it comes to cybersecurity. And a large part of that is because of the broad landscape that cybersecurity represents. When you think about a cybersecurity person compared to, and I'm not saying anything is wrong with database experts, but database experts, when they come in and apply for a job, often are going to say, look, I know Oracle, I know MS SQL, I'm a data scientist, and I know Cloudera or whatever it happens to be. That is going to be their area of expertise, and you're likely going to be hiring them explicitly for that expertise in that area because you own that technology. Cybersecurity tends to be a bit different. You're going to hire somebody who has some baseline foundation, whether it be network or endpoint or maybe even application or database security. The fact is most of the time these people are going to wind up wearing significantly more hats than what you hired them for. It's going to be years before they're ready to be a true expert in their field of whatever the flavor of the day, whatever type of new hack it is that's coming out. That's one of the things we thought we talked about when we did these predictions. We decided not to talk about a lot of the hacks that were going to be here. We will get to some, I'll tell you. But we've decided not to talk about all the hacks that are going to be out because the fact is the hackers are like water. They're going to take the path of least resistance. So when we think about what they're going to be doing, it changes every single day. It changes by industry. It changes by what tools they happen to use or what tools happen to be available. When we think about applying AI and machine learning to this type of environment, we're looking for AI and machine learning to be able to do things that the humans can't do. Yes, decrease the number of alerts, but also be able to help provide more complex CAPTCHA, help be able to baseline user behavior, whether that be database user behavior, end user behavior, application user behavior. Be able to do things and correlate things, building peering and other sorts of peering and clustering and other sorts of things into the technologies that help identify without the alert, but just simply monitoring the activity and being able to do things interesting with that activity, that without that automation, you wouldn't be able to identify the activity from a human, whether you had the skills or not. So this takes it where organizations need to hire people who can understand the output of a technology that's going to be able to provide them context on activity happening within an environment. This is what we see as a growth model within 2019, within all vendors and all technologies, and an adoption rate I think that's going to be quite high in 2019 as companies look to leverage this type of technology in lieu of trying to, or I should say, in lieu of expecting their cybersecurity professionals to know absolutely everything. Now, I'll tell you, the other corollary to this is going to be not just the use of AI and machine learning, but I also expect to see an increase in the adoption of security services from organizations. Organizations often use security services anyway, but I fully expect to see more of a service model style usage here, an OpEx versus a CapEx versus buying a piece of technology. I also see a shift here where you may use AI and machine learning, or you may actually use a service where somebody just simply outsources their security to someone else who focuses on that type of security every single day. So we have a special mention here for cyber warfare, and I brought this up as part of the prediction primarily because I'm seeing more and more of it, and I see this all the time, and quite frankly, the question comes up all the time in a little bit different way. So in 2019, given the landscape where we live, or the temperature of politics and governments today, I do see this growing in 2019. Consider the things that 2018 has for us, and likely aren't to get significantly better in 2019. Consider the fact that we, at least in the United States, we have tariff battles, and I suppose on the other side of that are countries that there may be some tariff battles with. Immigration reform, nation-state expansion around the world, and the bigger factor in 2019, at least for the U.S., is going to be the 2019 election cycle.